So I dabble in building some things with my hands every now and then. Now, granted, one of the materials that I do not work with at all really is glass because I it takes a little bit too much, I guess, expertise for me to feel comfortable working with it, and I have yet to install any windows ever. I've only ever really worked with wood, drywall, and materials that are pretty forgiving because if you make a mistake, you can very frequently just do another cut, right? But with glass, you make a mistake, it's cracked, and there's no room for error, is what I'm saying. Now, this is why I'm excited about this particular press release, which is glass like wood insulates heat, is tough, blocks UV, and has wood grain pattern, but it is also translucent. It allows light to transfer through it. So I can see some really important and really, I should say, very pertinent applications to this when it comes to having a material that you can shave and that you can possibly form easily that does not require expertise to use properly. Or I shouldn't say use properly, but it doesn't require expertise to get the job done, if that makes sense. So I could see very useful applications of a material like this. Something that is like wood, has very similar properties as wood, and but has the translucent capabilities that glass has. So with that, I'll go through this. So need light but want privacy. A new type of wood that's transparent, tough, and beautiful could be the solution. This nature-inspired building material allows light to come through at about 80%. So that in of itself is pretty darn impressive. Anything that allows 80% of light to pass through is pretty high up there, especially for a material that has a structural component to it, something that is rigid and something that is able to withstand at least some force. That is impressive. To see it in something that isn't technically, well, it is technically plastic, but it's not a completely man-made material. But the material itself is naturally hazy, or 30 or 95, or sorry, 93% hazy, which is preventing others from seeing inside. Material engineers at the University of Maryland have transformed wood into a transparent building material that directs light for a diffused effect. Is tougher and insulates better than glass, and has a natural wood grain pattern. Now, granted, very nowadays, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of glass windows will have multiple panes inside them, and also be filled with different types of gases that do not leak easily, or they're under some form of vacuum. And this is a way to allow glass to be to have a lot more insulative properties than a solid piece of glass would normally. But that will also require some level of expertise in order to do those types of installations. So continuing, they published the results last week in the journal Nature Communications. So in this patented research, we demonstrate the first aesthetic wood with patterns following the density variation in natural wood. So these patterns that you see will show the density differences that are present within the normal cellulose structure. And then such patterned transparent wood can also block UV light and heat. This is mechanically strong, which could find many applications in buildings where sustainability and high energy efficiency are desired, said these people. So tiny nanostructures made of cells pass water and nutrients up and down a tree, and that would be the xylem, right? But they hold importance here as vertically aligned channels in the wood, and which is a naturally grown structure that can be used to pass light along. So these channels that are formed will have they're basically tubes, right? And these tubes can function probably very similarly to, say, fiber optics, where light will be able to pass through it if it's done in the right orientation. So the team started with a small block of Douglas fir and used chemicals to selectively remove its lignin, the part that makes the wood brown and strong. So what is lignin especially? So lignin is made up, it's a polymer made up of a lot of the aromatic components of wood. So this would be an example of a lignin polymer. So it's a class of compounds or organic polymers that form key structural materials in the support tissues of vascular plants and some algae. Lignins are particularly important in the formation of the cell wall, especially in wood and bark, because they lend rigidity and do not rot easily. Chemically, lignins are cross-linked phenolic polymers. So these aromatic groups that have these alcohol groups coming off of those. These are phenyl groups, and these phenyl groups can very frequently polymerize with each other given the right circumstances. And so this material is very nice because it's hydrophobic, right? So this is a very hydrophobic, highly highly aromatic structure. So it blocks a lot of light. It is very insoluble. And what I should also mention is that the reason why it's used for structural material is because it is very resistant to degradation. So it's very hard to break this stuff down. In fact, you might have heard of the research going into cellulosic ethanol, or the ability to produce ethanol from cellulose. Now, one of the major hurdles to doing this is that this lignin is surrounding and penetrating into the cell walls of, or it's basically mixed in with all the cellulose that is in the plant material. And so this makes it extremely difficult to do chemical hydrolysis or enzymatic hydrolysis of the cellulose, because this lignin is insoluble and it's not allowing those enzymes or chemicals to reach the cellulose economically. So we are able to break down cellulose down into simpler carbohydrates, and then those simpler carbohydrates can be fermented into ethanol. That is definitely possible. However, it is not economically viable right now because the process of either removing or destroying the lignin in of itself is pretty costly. So that is what lignin is, and lignin, as a result, is opaque, or it absorbs a lot of light. So they had to remove this lignin from the cellulose in order to get this structure. Anyways, this makes the wood transparent to light, and they left behind all the other cell structures of the wood, which provide a natural pattern. So many people might argue that having a natural pattern could be viewed as more pleasant to the eye. There's an aesthetic to it, right? So having these natural patterns might allow us to suspend our disbelief that we're living in an artificial environment. We might be able to convince ourselves psychologically that, oh yes, I am actually working with natural products. I'm working with very products that make me closer to nature, right? And so I'm probably going to have some mental health benefits to surrounding myself with natural materials. So that is something that needs to be considered. So the remaining wood cell structure also directs light straight through the plank. So the wood is cut against the grain so that the channels that drew water and nutrients up from the roots lie along the shortest dimension. So what ends up happening is when they cut the wood, all the channels, all those tubes are going to be perpendicular to the cut. And what that's going to be equivalent to is basically having a bunch of straws that are stacked together to make a plank, right? So that is what you're seeing here, which is what is allowing the light to penetrate in that particular direction. So the cell structure that still remains bounces the light around just a little bit, which is a property called haze, but in general, the light travels directly through microchannels in the wood. At no matter what angle the sun strikes, the light travels perpendicularly through the wood and consistently falls on the same diffuse area all day. So what this is going to be doing is it's going to function pretty similarly to fiber optic channels, where it's going to be directing light in one direction, or mostly in one direction. And yes, there's going to be a little bit of bouncing back and forth, but for the most part, it's going to be straight through. So the researchers simulated a room with a ceiling made of the new aesthetic wood, as researchers have dubbed it, and showed that it insulates better than glass. Aesthetic wood inherits characteristics from wood and epoxy, which is another major ingredient in the process. So remember, they removed the lignin, right? And so they have to replace that lignin with something, because you cannot just have air or water in between in those channels, because that air or water is going to make it very easy for the cellulose to become degraded. So remember, I was saying the lignin is protecting the cellulose. It is creating a barrier from the cellulose to be degraded by other processes, rot, for instance. So when wood rots, one of the ways that wood rots is these molds, or I should say these fungi, are going to produce lignases. They're going to produce, basically they're producing enzymes that are able to take oxygen and burn the lignin slowly, and by removing that lignin, it then releases, or I should say, reveals all of the delicious carbohydrates that have been protected by it. So this as a result, if they remove it, they have to replace it with something else to re-protect that cellulose. And one of the ways to do that is with epoxy. And they chose epoxy, I presume, because it's probably cheaper and it's clear, right? So the ability to have um, a clear matrix for the cellulose can be very beneficial. So let's see. Aesthetic wood proved to be 2.5 times more effective at blocking heat than glass, and 3.5 times as tough as untreated wood. That's actually remarkable that you can produce a product out of wood that is still, I would presume this is still mostly wood, right? And it only is using a little bit of epoxy to refill the gaps that the lignin was in earlier. So this epoxy plus the cellulose is creating a product that is stronger, much stronger than untreated wood, which is phenomenal because you can use that as a structural material. So windows, they can't be structural. The glass, I should say, cannot be structural. The frames themselves can be, but the glass itself cannot. I might have to append that because I think maybe with some greenhouses, glass is playing a structural material, but I it's not like you can put that much on the greenhouse. And I think most of the weight is going to be on the metal, not the glass itself. And I think also a lot of greenhouses use some sort of plastics as well rather than using glass. Regardless, for most household applications, glass is not going to be an effective structural material. However, this material that they have created, albeit probably it was expensive to do this entire process, they were able to make a material that could be used structurally. So I can see a lot of applications for that. Like I could imagine like rooms that you can build with this material, and then it could be this nice room that you can have a lot of light to the outside. And then maybe you still want to have windows in it, but then you can have windows and this material, and as a result, you can have basically an entirely protected but still very translucent room that can give you some connection to the outside world. So let's see. And it also effectively blocks UV light but allows visible light through. So I presume that the UV blockage a lot of that might come from the epoxy, because I believe epoxy does, I believe most epoxies do react with UV radiation. And that's something that I think that I haven't actually read the paper yet, so I don't know what type of epoxy they used, but I think they need to be careful about using this on external walls if they're going to be exposed to UV radiation, because I do believe some epoxy is very sensitive to UV radiation. So anyways, the researchers like the pattern made by the lighter brown early wood, so named it because it is produced early in the growth phase of the wood, and a darker late wood. So early wood has less lignin, but it has less material altogether, with cell walls about a quarter as thick. The researchers also tried basswood and pine, which can be used physically similarly and have lighter wood grain patterns. Invent Wood, a spin-off company from UMD, is commercializing this type of transparent wood technology. So this is excellent to see that there is an academic organization that has dipped its toes, or is at least trying to get into the small business market, or the startup market. So I think that this is amazing. Hopefully that they can develop a product that is cheap, affordable, and scalable, and something that I might be able to buy at a Lowe's or a Menard, or I guess I don't really go to Menards for any lumber, but I can go to, say, a Lowe's or a Lockridge nearby, and I could probably get something like this. And then you could just experiment with it, because there really isn't. Actually, I should also mention this would be really good for, say, if it is resilient, it could be good for things such as countertops or cabinetry, if you want to have the ability to look inside the cabinets without opening them. So rather than having to deal with the glass, which I just don't want to do frequently, if I could just buy this material and then just carve it myself and make small doors or make furniture, that would be phenomenal. So the way that most people do clear, or the most people who are working with clear materials, a lot of it has to do with epoxy or epoxy pores or different types of plastics. But to have a wood product that just has a little bit, or I should say, has some epoxy inside of it, but for the most part is clear because of the removal of the lignin, I think that could have many applications that to replace plastics that it could be viewed as a more natural and a more high quality plastic that could be worked with. So yeah, I'm excited, and hopefully this gets on the market as soon as possible, because I think it would be very interesting to work with this. So with that, thanks for watching, and hopefully I will see you tomorrow.